All right, today we are going to get into the life and ideas of one of India's most incredible figures, Aurobindo Ghosh. It's not often you find someone who was a radical revolutionary, a deep spiritual philosopher, and a poet, all rolled into one. He truly brought the worlds of politics and spirituality together in a way that almost no one else ever has.
Wow, what a statement, right? The prophet of nationalism. So who was this guy who could inspire that kind of description? Well, to really get Aurobindo, we need to rewind the clock, back to the beginning of the 20th century, a time when India was just bubbling with political energy.
So, let's start with part one, the radical revolutionary. This is where we'll see how Aurobindo really carved out a new path for the independence movement in a pretty divided India.
You see, Aurobindo very quickly became a leading voice for the more radical group, often called the extremists. He just saw this urgent need to fire up the masses, the everyday people, who he felt were being totally overlooked by the political leaders at the time.
And this split was huge. You had these two camps with completely different playbooks. On one side were the moderates. They believed in working within the British system, writing petitions, using constitutional methods, hoping for a slow, gradual path to self-rule. But Aurobindo and the extremists, they had a totally different vision. They were like, no way. They had zero trust in British intentions and were calling for big things: mass action, self-reliance with the Swadeshi movement, and a real willingness to sacrifice for the cause.
But here's what made Aurobindo's approach so incredibly powerful. It was how he framed the whole struggle. For him, this wasn't just some political argument. He saw India, the nation, as a divine mother, as a goddess. And that one idea, it was a total game changer. It transformed the fight for independence from a political goal into a sacred religious duty. Suddenly, freedom wasn't just a right, it was a spiritual quest.
So, this of course brings up a really critical question, one that the whole radical wing had to wrestle with. If this fight is a sacred duty, what are the rules? How far are you willing to go for your motherland?
And his answer to this is actually pretty unique and, really pragmatic. Aurobindo wasn't an all-or-nothing kind of guy on this. He argued that your response has to match the oppression you're facing. So, if the British allowed peaceful protest, great, nonviolent resistance is the way to go. But if that oppression turned brutal, if it became absolute, then he believed you couldn't just take violence off the table.
And this brings us to a massive turning point in his life, a single event that would change everything. Part 2, the prison transformation.
So because of all his revolutionary work, he gets arrested. He's put in jail for a year. And you might think, okay, that's a huge setback for his political career. But for Aurobindo, this year in prison wasn't a pause. It was the catalyst that would completely reshape his entire life and purpose.
It was during that year in jail that he had this profound spiritual awakening. He called it the Adesh, which literally means the command. He felt it was the divine instruction to stop looking outward at politics and to turn inward, to begin the journey of understanding the true self. And after this command, he did something shocking. He retired from politics, completely.
So what does a retired revolutionary mastermind do? Well, he turns that incredible intellect to a whole new project, which brings us to part 3, evolution of the self. He began to map out a new philosophy for humanity's spiritual journey.
He started laying out this framework for how all of us, as a collective, how our consciousness evolves. He saw it as a clear progression, like a roadmap with distinct stages that every society has to move through to reach its full spiritual potential.
And he broke it down into 4 stages. Let's just walk through them. First, you got the symbolic stage, a kind of primitive phase where we see the divine in symbols. Then we move into the conventional stage, and this is where organized religion comes in and makes all those ideas really rigid and formal. After that, we hit the individualist stage. You can think of the European Enlightenment here, where reason and individual freedom start to push back against all that rigid convention. But for Aurobindo, that wasn't the end of the line. The real goal was stage 4, the subjective stage.
And this subjective stage, this is a whole shebang. This is the peak of his philosophy. It's all about moving beyond just pure reason into a state of true spiritual freedom. What does that mean? It means you realize deep down the unity between yourself and every other person. To recognizing that the same divine force, he called it the Virat Purusha, the supreme being, exists in everyone.
Okay, so we've looked at 2 very different sides of Aurobindo, haven't we? The political firebrand on one side and the spiritual master on the other. But were they really 2 separate things? Or was he building toward one single unified vision this whole time? Just listen to this quote from him.
It pulls everything together so perfectly. He eventually came to believe that you could never have real, lasting political freedom without first having an inner spiritual freedom. The two weren't just related, they were totally connected.
And this is his ultimate takeaway. Political freedom? Yeah, it's absolutely necessary. It creates the kind of society where people can explore their spiritual side. But it's just the starting line, not the finish line. For Aurobindo, a nation full of people who are politically free but spiritually empty isn't truly free at all. You see that divine mother he fought for as a revolutionary? He came to realize that that same divinity was the spirit inside every single person. True liberation is when you get both.
So, we're left with this really powerful question that his work basically leaves at our feet. It challenges our entire definition of what freedom even means. It asks us to look past just politics and governments and to think about what it really means for a nation and for each of us to be genuinely and completely free.